be tempted all day long. Tempted with other women, tempted with alcohol, tempted with bad business practices, or anything having to do with illegal business. And that it was men that were barraged all day long with the temptation, the day of temptation. A good Victorian woman had the ability to bring that man home safe by creating an amazing home, having the perfect children, very important, making sure the food was, on point, and making sure that her body was perfectly groomed and weighed for her man. If a woman somehow didn't do any of these things, and we're going to go into them in specific, she was doing something wrong. Now, food was very, very important for the Victorians, psychologically. At the beginning of the week, a wife would go up to her husband, and she would ask him what he wanted to eat for the week. She would then, you can come in late to my class, and if you do, you got to take out those heels, okay? Thanks, no problem. And so at the beginning of the week, a wife would go up to her husband and ask him what he wanted to eat for the week. She would then draw a menu up. He would look at the menu for the week, and he would make changes if changes were needed. Because food for the Victorian had a psychological component. And let's see if you can kind of figure it out just a little. If a man knew that food, his food, the food he loved, was waiting for him at home, psychologically, what would that do in the mind of that man?
Motivate him to go home.
Motivate him to go home quickly, with absolutely no pit stops. And you know what I'm talking when I say a pit stop, right? Because we're living during the day of temptation. So psychologically, a man knew in the morning what he was going to eat that night, and hopefully to allow his animalistic, hunger feel, remind him that she was going to be working, that she was going to be setting the table, that all this was in preparation, his sanctuary, his castle, and that he needed to come home quickly, real quick. And so, at the end of the evening, at the end of the day, a wife would always wait for her husband near the door. Her body needed to have that hourglass look the Victorians thought was perfect. And if she got just a little thick, then a good girdle, a good Victorian girdle could squeeze the fat maybe just a little in. Her hair, although they weren't into much makeup or colors of nails, it was all about her dress, her hair, her curve, her sense of sensuality. Because if she wasn't there to meet him looking really good, what could psychologically happen maybe on another day of temptation? Absolutely, maybe a smaller, skinnier, younger version. So for the Victorians, the way that women looked was absolutely very important in order to do what? Save her man. When she would greet him at the door, she would escort him to the dormitory. There, she would have a new set of clothes ready for him to change to. Then she would escort him. It was all about the art. It was all about the grace. It was all about the beauty. It was all about creating this delicate balance, this beautiful feeling that he had just walked into a sanctuary. That he was there, and all the evils of the world, all the day of temptation, everything he probably maybe could have thought of was all erased, and it was her responsibility to create this amazing balance in the home. She would escort him to the dining room. The children would wait for Papa there. No problems with the children at the table. All the problems had to be taken care of before Papa got home because Papa was tempted all day long. At the table, children would not speak unless spoken to, and I know we've heard that old cliche, it's so Victorian, so incredibly Victorian. A wife would not guide the conversation at the table. She always needed to have an eye on her husband if he wanted to speak, because this was his time. This was his time to receive this sort of like healing from the day of temptation. At the table, she would only speak in few words if he spoke first. No problems could be given to Dad at this moment, Papa. This was his time to eat his food. Remember, not only did he work all day, he came home on time. This was Papa's time. A good father, a good husband would always, in order to role model the same behavior, would always tell his wife how good the food was, so the children would listen to. A good husband saying that to his wife. He would express a bit of loveliness in terms of words, how beautiful your hair look, how beautiful the fresh flowers look. The Victorians were all about setting the most amazing table. From the linen, to the cut flowers, to the porcelain plates, to the correct goblet of water, different than the wine glass. I mean, they were all about the beauty of the home, because this, every little message, every little perfection on his wife, every perfect little living room, aerial rugs, porcelain boxes, paintings, everything was a symbol to remind him that this was his home, and that she worked hard for him, and that he had perfect children. And it was a message today: you don't screw it up by what you might be exposed to out there. You don't screw it up, because this is all for you. After dinner, a man would be escorted by his children and his wife to the drawing room, what we call today the living room. There, a woman, and we'll deal with a little girl's education, a woman would play the piano. The piano and the Victorian lady, that was like, you grew up, you have fingers, you first touched a keyboard. Because the piano, or playing the piano for her husband, was a way of almost appeasing the animalistic side of a man. And remember, he had been tempted all day long. So the way she played the piano was a way to kind of soften him up, you know? The children, on the other hand, would read poetry out loud. Papa would correct the intonations of the way they read their poetry. A good father would praise their sons and daughters that their poetry was very, well spoken. While she played the piano, it was the perfect picture. We also call the Victorian era the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age. Because everything, every little piece of wood in that living room was gold. And it was the picture of gold. A beautiful, gentle, submissive wife. A man that worked so hard and said no to temptation, and perfect, lovely, well-spoken children. The Gilded Age. After this beautiful picture of a family, the children would, of course, be escorted to their dormitory. And now, well, now it was Papa's turn to receive what he so desired or craved for. So, you know, she couldn't say, oh no, honey, not tonight, you know, I have a headache. You know what I'm talking about? Sexuality for the Victorian was very simple and very plain. The anatomy said it all. And if the anatomy was composed that way, that was God's rule over sexuality. Men had an erection. They were subject to that erection during the day, wantingly or not. Women, of course, they thought, it's not until the 60s, and we'll get into the 60s in terms of the sexual revolution later. Women, for the Victorians, they didn't have an erection. And so it was simple. Women were there simply to provide, let me put it as pretty as I can, women were there simply to provide a safe harbor for a man to dock in. Are you getting the metaphors?
Yeah.
So she didn't feel sexual. And she couldn't really express sexuality because then that would have made her almost like unattractive. A very sexual woman in bed for the Victorians was something that just made no sense because she did not need that. And if she was very sexual in bed, you know what I'm talking about, very sexual, maybe like, you know, a little moan or groan, I don't know. Maybe she was doing something she shouldn't be doing during the day. And so a man's sexual realm was, you know, of course, all for his pleasure. And he asked for it on the man because if somehow she would say no, then possibly what could happen on another day of temptation? You'll go somewhere else. Skinnier, smaller, younger version. And so sexuality was very clear. And of course, the second, other than docking in good, the second thing was, of course, to have babies. To have babies. And I'll tell you why babies are important in a few minutes. Now, this was the picture. This was a man's domain. And before maybe some of you judge this a little, I mean, this is crazy, all right? So I'm not going to hide that. I mean, are there any guys in the class that believe that we should go back to those times? No, because the girls are going to kick your ass after class. But this was the picture. Now, the Victorian family was very aggressive in terms of grandfathers, uncles, aunts, the whole Victorian family, because if a man maybe one night would not go home, or if a man maybe got home 2 hours late, it was very clever the way the Victorian woman set this up. She would invite the family, his mother, his father, his brother, his sister, absolutely anybody according to his family, and she would make sure that they would all be there for dinner, and she would tell her husband, and they were the ones, the extended family were the ones that made sure that that man was on point every single day. They were the ones that would visit his business or where he worked. They were the ones that made sure that he was on time. The family was all about protecting the family and not allowing that family to fall into shame. Let me deal with other sexual formulas of the time. Let me deal with homosexuality and sort of like the thinking behind homosexuality. Homosexuality in many societies, and let me go ahead and go towards my end of my sentence before you cut me off in your thinking. Homosexuality in many societies, and especially in the Victorians, was absolutely no problem, no brainer. I mean, the Victorians believed that it was infantile, that somehow a man did not progress and somehow part of him got stuck in that sort of infantile nature of same-sex attraction. The problem with the Victorian was when that man would somehow alter the formula of the family. So if a man had any other sexual liaisons, we're looking at also, we'll attach to this, we'll attach a lover. It was really not a problem. And economically, it would serve well poor women because, you know, richer men would support these poor lovers, poor women. And it was never a problem in terms of any sexual side event, as long as he was home at the same time, absolutely every day, sitting down for dinner, and that whatever occurred in that family or whatever occurred outside that family would never touch the family. It is not till the 1960s, and we'll deal with the 60s eventually, that there's a total paradigm shift from we could do whatever we want to do as long as my family is not altered, as long as the model of the family is not changed, we could do whatever we have to do. And the paradigm shift in the 60s was marriage, relationships, men with men holding hands on the streets, women and women. All of a sudden, what was accepted in many societies, as long as it was kept in the closet, as long as it was kept in secret, was then the great debate of being gay in any society. For the Victorians, as long as that man was at home at that right time, and as long as that family was not altered one little bit, there is no problem. And that included, of course, female lovers. The problem is when he would get home late, or if monies would be missing, or if a sense of dullness would take over him with his family. That was the problem. All right. Any questions? Any questions you want to throw at me? Any curiosities? Anything you want to ask? All right. Let's deal with the law and the Victorians. The law during this time was absolutely very, very cruel to women. You see, women weren't seen as able to deal with the complexities of owning property. You know, taxes, repairs. So property during this time, and that includes in most countries of the world, property only was able to be held by men, and it would go in terms of an inheritance from man to man. Because women could not own because, of course, she was not able to do the right thing. She didn't have that capabilities. So young families, young families had to quickly make sure they had a baby. But not just a baby boy. Because in the case of the death or premature death of a husband, if there was no baby boy in the mix, then property needed to go to, there were girls, let's say, they only had girls, and he died, the father, then property would have to go to an uncle, you know, a cousin, a distant relative, you know, anyone male, with the hope that that uncle or cousin or distant male relative would do what would be best for that family and not necessarily squander the money, move the family out, and really take all the belongings because he owned it. But if there was a baby boy in the mix, then property would go to that baby boy. The mother would have an input with the courts, but you didn't have a second or a third party like an uncle or a cousin. So it was very important when a young couple married quickly to start having babies, because if they shot wrong and they had girls, their monies, their properties were not secure. A boy legally could hold property even if that baby boy was 1 day old. Now let me backpedal just a little bit here. Pregnancy for the Victorian, obviously after what I said, it was very important. Let me talk to you about, like, what do the Latinos call it? Lo quince, right? Lo quince. Y los americanos que le llaman the Sweet 16. Did you ever see that on TV, the Sweet 16? That wasn't the right color BMW I wanted. I used to love that show. When a girl would have her first menstrual cycle, it would be announced that she had become a lady, a complete lady. And those were like the little kind of symbols or messages. Oh, she became a lady. She has her first, and people would congratulate her. 5, 6 months later, there would be a party thrown. And, you know, this is a time where the family kind of threw out, you know, their medal, you know what I mean, in terms of how much they would spend in the party. But the party was not about the party. The party was not necessarily about the food or the china or, like, you know, the whole ceremonial thing. You know how the Victorians were all about the ceremony? You know that if you know about, you know, at least in my own Cuban culture, lo quince. You see, when a little girl was born to a responsible Victorian father, year after year after year after year, he would put money away in order for him to create what is called historically a dowry. A dowry. Dowry is just a savings account. And when she would have her first menstrual cycle and the eventual party to take her out into society, that father, a good father, a responsible father, would have accrued a lot of money. So during this celebration, this party, there would be a time where the father, along with his wife, along with his family, would stand somewhere ceremoniously in front of the party, and he would announce what?
That she could be married. That she could be married.
That she could be married, and most importantly, the amount of money that she was coming with. Now, look at the psychological threads here for a moment, okay? She could marry someone that hopefully she fell in love with, but do you think that father had a say-so in who she married?
Yes.
Yes or no?
Yes.
Why?
Because he's the one giving the money.
Because family was important.
You're Janisa, right?
Yeah.
That's right, because he had invested all this money. And so the Victorians were very smart, because look, in order to live this Victorian ideal, in order to allow women to live this life, the best combination was to unite two fortunes, two monies. So do you really think that a father that had invested year after year after year and did the responsible thing, do you think that he was going to let his daughter marry a commoner or someone poor or someone that didn't come with money? Hell no. So this whole idea that the Victorians were like all romantic and, you know, they were all like sweet and everything was about the beauty and the art of the words and the literature and the picnics. I mean, you've seen some of these Victorian movies and I could recommend some real good ones. It was all based, marriages was all based on the ability to live this lifestyle and the union of two fortunes. And that's why after marriage, real quickly, the babies had to begin. Because then that money would be then secure with the birth of a baby boy. And the whole notion of a baby girl was a wasted, shot at securing that money. So it pretty much was, I'm sure people fell in love, and hopefully they fell in love the right way, like when my boys, they like a girl, I always say, well, what is her major in college? Like one of them the other day goes, oh no, she goes to beauty school, and I'm like, hell no. No, I'm not gonna let you marry someone that goes, well, there's nothing wrong with beauty school, but, anyways. I guess there's a little Victorian, everywhere. Alright. Any questions? Anything in your notes you need for me to backpedal? Any questions? Anything you want to ask? Peter, can you take out your gun and remind them that 10% of the grade is participation? Can you say it really aggressive?
10% is participation.
Oh, Peter. I'll have to practice in the office.
Are we gonna go back to the pregnancies? Because we skipped around a little bit. Are there any more specifics on it?
On pregnancy,
like
the only other thing that's really interesting to me about children and pregnancy is that if a child would be born, let's say, blind or deaf, or if a child would be born with some form of abnormality, physical or mental, the idea was that God had punished that bloodline, that family for some previous ancestral sin, and that child would not be allowed to be painted or photographed eventually with the family. And that child would always be kept in a part of the house or maybe some other property near the house or maybe some family or relative that really didn't care taking the child in because somehow that deaf or blind or let's say a cleft palate or some physical abnormality would not allow the Victorians to have the perfect picture of a family and would remind people that that family must have sinned along the ways. So I wanted to add that to pregnancy. Other than that, the rule was get her pregnant as many times as you can. What's the next question?
Did the Victorians have a certain stand on sex before marriage?
A what?
A certain stand on sex before marriage.
Well, no, it just didn't happen.
Like at all? Never?
And the father made sure, after putting all that money away, that she went from the menstrual cycle straight to marriage. And we're talking marriage 16, 17, 18, and by 19, already having a first child. And that would secure, at least in the case of women, that she would not lose her virginity, beforehand. While the sexual rules for men were absolutely different, because there was no such thing as virginity for men. It was, not at all. Well, I don't even have to go there. You know what the rules are. They're still kind of in place. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
If a family was to have nothing but daughters, would he be looked down upon by society?
If a woman couldn't get pregnant, oh my God. That was God's wrath on that family. And it didn't allow her to be a mother. It didn't allow her to create this home. It didn't allow any of it. And so God had clearly put his distaste on that family. If she only had girls, there was always the next pregnancy. Because remember, they started marriage and pregnancy very young.
But like in Pride and Prejudice, where the mother only has daughters, does the father get looked down upon? Because there's no more children coming in. They've already hit an age where
Yeah,
it's
that they
not
can.
happening.
Not as shameful as a woman not being able to give birth. No.
Okay, so
Not
it's
as-
not like the ideal Victorian family, but it's still higher than that.
Then no children at all.
Okay.
And I guess the hope in that case was that nothing would happen to that man at all.
So I have another question. Would
Yes,
he
sir.
be able to remarry if the wife couldn't reproduce? Would he be able to move on, or would he have to stick with?
You know, I know that if a Victorian couple fell into disgrace, and disgrace meaning, you know, divorce or temporary separation, I mean, there were divorces during this time period. I mean, there were divorces from the time of Moses, you know, where there was, it's funny because in the time of Moses, if a girl said that she knew how to cook real good, and she didn't know how to cook real good, and she had lied that she knew how to cook real good, but she didn't, then he could divorce her because she lied. I mean, you have to read some of the laws to see, oh my God, you know, you can play with that. If a family fell into disgrace with divorce, there was something she did wrong. Either she did not provide her body well enough, or she didn't provide good food, or the house wasn't perfect, or she just did something wrong that allowed that man to take advantage of the day of temptation.
So it was always the woman's fault?
It's always the woman's fault.
You see, you have to understand that although you might be thinking, oh my God, this was horrible for women, and you know that that's the same thing I'm thinking. But you gotta understand that this was like a spiritual charge. This was like, this woman had this great responsibility, and it was an awesome responsibility, and it was amazing, because how many people could say in this world, and this is where I want you to have the balance in your brain, how many people could say in this world, in this class today, that you have saved someone? And that's a great feeling. If you have ever saved the life of someone, if you've ever stopped someone from getting into a car because they're drunk and you've taken the keys, if you've ever rescued someone from a drowning situation, if you've just, I don't know, saved someone from eating French fries because they're fat as shit, you know? If you've ever saved anyone, it's a great feeling. So women had this huge charge to create this beautiful home, to understand food, to understand how to please her husband. And ultimately, she was the amazing one because she saved a family. That's the way they saw it.
Could a woman file for divorce if the husband was caught with the lover? Like, you know how it said that if it doesn't affect the family, it doesn't matter? What if she caught him affecting the family?
Well,
Could she file?
No. But you got a two-part question there. If she caught him, but the family was in good standing financially, the property, the home, the maintenance, if he was a responsible man, and he was caught in an affair, it was because the day of temptation was too heavy.
No, but what if it affected...
But if it affected the family because he left, or it was out somehow, or he just wasn't providing food or something, then yes, she could. It was a process of maybe trying to save him again, maybe the grandmother, maybe the mother, maybe the uncles, maybe everyone in the family coming together, quickly surrounding him and reminding him. And so there would be a lot of intervention because divorce is shameful. And even today, you talk to anyone that goes through a divorce, it is the most horrible experience that the human psyche can go through, even if there are really good justifications. And for the Victorian, it was God's wrath. There was something wrong with that woman. There was something wrong with that woman. A woman's education was all about the piano. This is called, by the way, before I give you the list here, it's a no-brainer list, it's the obvious. This is called, historically, the cult of domesticity. Domesticity, coming from the word domestic. Domesticity. So a woman was bred to play the piano, understand the ingredients of food, understand linen versus cotton, understand how to set the table, understand how to look at what good tapestry is, what bad tapestry is. I mean, you can go on the list. The Victorians were all about collectibles. And she was bred for that one great day of her marriage, when she would have the awesome experience of saving her family and establishing God's kingdom on earth. That's the way they saw it. The family was God's kingdom on earth. She had such an amazing responsibility. She was the light of the family. The light that would hopefully change the darkness in that man's life. You get it?
Can we talk about the courtesans?
The what?
The women that were prostitutes at this time?
Prostitution?
Yeah.
That's a very good question, because now what you really are asking, what were the classes like? Poor women, wealthy women, or poor women and women of some means. Before I get into your prostitution thing, let me just say the following. If a woman could not stay at home, live in a very comfortable home, do what she was bred and trained and do what God had instructed the female anatomy to do, if she couldn't do that because she was a poor woman, because she had to work in a factory or an industry, or in the worst case scenario, prostitution, then she really wasn't a woman. And you gotta understand that psychological line, because it's all about the self-esteem. It's all about the way one perceives, each other gender. A real woman that God has blessed, but a real woman had to live under the Victorian family. But if the family was poor, or the husband was just a mere clerk, or someone of no possible means, she could not really live. Let me say it to you again. She could not really live as a woman. Now let me see if I can relate this to men. Men that lose their jobs have the fear of falling into a massive depression, because men equate their manhood with their careers. Do you get that? At least?
Yeah.
Okay, well most of your girls are like, okay, but like, I have all these friends, we're going through bad times, and these men, when they lose their jobs, she said they've lost their life, because that's what they were trained to be. You're a provider, and if you're not providing, you're not a man. For women, if they couldn't live this lifestyle, she really wasn't a woman. So they worked in industry. Of course, we're going through eventually the Industrial Revolution and prostitution. Now, I've read a lot about prostitution in Cuba, what we call la jinetera, and people they laugh, I do too at that, but I don't believe that people prostitute because they love sex. Of course, if you read any of the narratives, prostitutes, they hate sex, and they can't have sex even in their leisure time. It's the bottom of the pole. It is the worst place a woman could fall And for some women, especially the women of Cuba, the ones that prostitute, it's a matter of survival. In an industrial country like the United States, that we have a lot of opportunities, it's all about the drugs. A lot of it is the drugs. You fuel yourself, you prostitute, you fuel up again, drugs. And I don't know which one is the one fueling what, but that's the cycle. Prostitution has always been a viable, quick dispensation, is that a word? Dispenssion of one's clogged up tubes. I hope you can read between the lines. But it didn't matter, as long as you were there on time. And that was very convenient because you could probably do a quickie and then make it home on time for dinner. So yeah, of course it was there. Men that really liked, let's say, a certain specific whore would maintain her, which was good. It was acceptable. I mean, class, you have to understand, it didn't matter what a man did. It didn't matter. In any sexual model, it didn't matter what they did. It's just a family could not be touched. That was it. That's the bottom line. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
If the wife was not able to save the family, or if she had some type of affair, what kind of punishment would be in place?
Well, that's demonic. I mean, can you imagine the Virgin Mary having sex? Could you, sir?
I
You don't do that. That never happened. Right?
Theoretically.
Theoretically.
Yeah.
A woman could never do that. First of all, it was very clear. A woman didn't feel sexual desires.
Well, isn't it that the society told them they didn't feel it? Because deep down, it's human. You have to, it's just the way humans are. You're going to feel that sexual desire one thing or another. So when she did feel it, and when she did stray away from her husband, and she was caught, what would happen? Because it was bound to happen. It's impossible for it not to happen.
And that's why Kate Chopin's work, we're going to be reading it, I'll tell you about that in a few minutes or later, because there were women during this era that complained that they did feel sexual desires in their anatomy. But that has always been a very big threat, especially to a male-dominant culture. A woman feeling sexual is a very threatening weapon. I don't know if for men in this generation, although I dare to say some, but it was a threat for the Victorian. How can a woman feel sexual? I mean, how can your mother feel sexual? My mother can't feel sexual, my grandmother can't feel sexual, that's crazy. So when society tells you that that's wrong and that's evil, and you feel it inside your body, and we'll be dealing with this with the girls of the 1920s, we got a problem. Because then what sets in? Shame. Any other questions?
So then what would happen to them? Because there has to be those
Oh, no.
girls that just don't give a shit and would do it anyways,
Mhm.
regardless the outcome.
I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it was all about the secrecy.
And if they were caught, could they be sent to jail? Could they be
No.
arrested?
No. No.
So it was just it? They're caught, that's it?
They have shamed their family. They have shamed their family.
Did they be killed?
No. You know, it's funny, I mean, I love to say this because Jesus Christ, to me, was and is a feminist. Do you want an explanation of that one? I have all my little homeschooling pieces. Jesus Christ was and is a feminist because once and for all, he kind of made the sexual rules even. In the Old Testament, if a woman was caught having sex with another man outside marriage, she would be stoned to death. If a man was caught having sex outside of marriage, he would go through a series of ceremonial baths. So now we go through the dispensation of grace with Jesus, and of course you know these verses. And that woman is brought to the court side or to the city side, you know, and she was caught doing it outside of her marriage. Remember that line? Remember those verses? And people were ready to take their stones because the law was, you get the bitch doing it, you stone her to death. In fact, in those verses, we don't even hear about the man. He's home taking a shower. And what does Jesus say? What is that famous little verse?
He who is without sin
You-
must cast the first stone.
The first stone. What did he do? Not only did he break the law, he brought up the role of women up to the role of men, which is she should not die. She should live like him. And that makes him a feminist. Because basically feminism is anything that will help the survival of women according to the perceptions or the rules or the laws or the social norms of that society. What other questions do you have into class?
If a family only had a son, but he had disability, would he still receive the
I'm not sure. I'm not sure because probably most people wouldn't even know they had a child with a disability.
But what if it was an obvious disability, like death, blind? Would he receive inheritance?
I don't know. I don't know. Those type of kids, where people did not know they existed.
So they wouldn't like publicly say that they have a kid if you have
They wouldn't, and he wouldn't go to any birthday parties or any family ceremonial events. He wouldn't go to anything. Because he was a reminder that that family had sin in their bloodline. So he was ashamed to the family. I mean, you can understand from the Victorians all the way down when we go through a period of if you're blind, if you're deaf, you know, blind kids go to blind school, and I've never thought of that. It's like, how could you put 100 blind people together? You know what I mean? It's like, it's crazy. All right, any other questions? All right, let me go ahead and move on. Let's go to your next historical marker, World War I. World War I ends in 1917. It was called the Great War. Now, I tell you that we live in societies that we believe one thing, and we all, like cattle, run